Good afternoon and welcome to Noronto Wants to Know with David Donoghue. Today, David's special guest is Brittany Mangelson. So good afternoon to both David and Brittany.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate the introduction. And I want to welcome Brittany to our show today. For those of you who don't know Brittany, I'm going to share an introduction that she actually wrote and provided to me. Brittany is an average gal from Utah who dove headfirst into a faith transition in 2013. She and her husband, Josh, joined Community of Christ in 2015, and she recently graduated from Community of Christ's Seminary. She is a full-time minister in the church, serving as a social media seeker ministry specialist, and is a mother of 3 children. She believes in grace, the worth of all persons, and is grateful to call Community of Christ her faith home. And Brittany, we are delighted to have you on the show today. We bumped Matt Damon for you, so thank you very much for being here, all the way from Utah. What time is it for you today, right now?
It is 1:02.
Okay, well, we're happy to have you here. Welcome. And Brittany, I'm going to start as I always do. I don't know if Robin warned you about this or not, but I always start with some silly icebreaker nonsense type of questions, and we'll see if you survive these or not. And your first nonsense question is, if you had to dress up as a cartoon character for a day, who would it be?
This is a good question and one that I have not thought about at all.
I guess it would be reassuring.
Yeah, yep, maybe. I guess it would depend on the season. So if it was winter, I would want to dress up as somebody warm. So maybe like Scooby-Doo. So I'd have like a head or something. It's like the first cartoon animal that came to mind. But if it's in the summer, gosh, I don't know. This is tricky. I'm trying to think of cartoons that I watched as a kid, not that my kids have watched, because those are much lamer than cartoons were in the 90s. I was really into Rugrats as a kid.
Okay.
So maybe one of the twins on the Rugrats, they had like these really cool overalls and, you know, like baby clothes. So they were just super comfortable, but also that sounds kind of weird. We're just going to go with Scooby-Doo.
Fair enough. Okay. And I like your analysis, you know, giving thought to the seasons and stuff.
I know. It was a tricky question.
Now, I happen to know from something you know, that bio I just shared was a sort of a condensed version of the one you sent me. And in the one you sent me, you mentioned that you consider yourself to be a cotton candy connoisseur.
Mm-hmm.
So I will need to ask you, what is the best cotton candy you've ever had? Or what is, if that's too difficult to think of, what is your favorite cotton candy flavor?
Okay, so I must confess that I feel like I need to backtrack on that self-proclaimed title, because I've seen a lot of videos where folks can actually make, you know, creatures and things and like these beautiful cotton candy bouquets. I can't actually do that. But I do have a cotton candy machine that I just kind of make blobs of goodness with. But one time I was at just kind of like a local street fair garden thing, and they had a cotton candy stand, and I purchased some chai cotton candy, and they made it in the shape of a bear. So it was this beautiful brown bear, and it tasted like a chai latte, and it was amazing. So
wow.
That would be my favorite.
Okay. I didn't even know that they made shapes out of cotton candy. That's a new one for me. Wow.
I know. It's incredible.
Okay, your final icebreaker question. This isn't so much of a nonsense, so we'll call it an icebreaker question. Which of the following 2 places would you most like to visit? The Grand Canyon or Bora Bora?
Well, this is easy for me just because I've been to the Grand Canyon a couple times and I live relatively close to it. So I would say Bora Bora because I've never been there.
Fair enough. I would agree with you. Even though I haven't been to the Grand Canyon, I would love to go to Bora Bora. Fair enough. Okay, so we'll move on now to some getting to know you questions. Can you tell us, Brittany, where you were born and where you were raised?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Provo, Utah, which is about an hour south of Salt Lake City. My parents both went to Brigham Young University. They were raised in Southern California, but then once they graduated college, they just stayed there and had all of us kids there and never moved from the first house they bought as newlyweds. And that's still where they live today. So Provo, Utah.
Wow. Okay. And did you serve on a mission in your youth?
I did not.
Okay.
So there was two ways to be a good Mormon girl, right? Either get married young or go on a Mormon mission, and I got married young. So that's what I did.
Fair enough. And can you tell us what's your favorite hymn and why?
Ooh, okay. This is a difficult question. So I actually read Community of Christ Sings from cover to cover within the first couple of weeks of finding you all. I didn't really know what to do with scripture or how to read scripture. And I was given this hymn book and I thought this is going to be my scripture for a while. And it was. So when I say I love the hymnal, I really do mean it. As far as my favorite though, again, that kind of depends on the season or, or what's happening. But I have to say that God, we gather as your children, the one that talks about LGBTQ inclusion and the tragedy that people are losing their lives over who they love. That one is absolutely beautiful to me. And also God of Grace and God of Laughter. Those two are probably my two favorite.
All right. Okay. Thank you for sharing. You've passed all those questions. That's very good. We'll now move on to some questions about, your life and what you do for the church and so forth. And so you're in your bio, you state that you dove headfirst into a faith transition back in 2013. Can you share with us how that came about?
Yeah, so I had always quietly had some issues with the faith of my birth. From the time I was a little kid, I was asking questions that I think my parents would have rather me not asked. But that's just kind of the person that I was. And I noticed gender inequality from the time I could remember. I have two older brothers and an older sister. And so seeing them advance in priesthood and things that they could do, but then not seeing my sister do the same. And then recognizing that the only reason why that wasn't happening was because she was a girl. And then also recognizing that that was going to happen to me. That was a struggle. It was a big struggle. So I already just questioned from the time I was a kid. Mm-hmm. However, I was super faithful. They have what they call just different class presidencies. I was a youth leader. I mean, I was in it. Graduated from high school seminary, their 4-year program, memorized scriptures, wanted to serve a mission, but my husband got in the way. I was pretty faithful. But I had those lingering questions in the back of my mind that I just couldn't get away from. And then in 2013, my husband had been just studying church history, and we had disagreed with different things of the LDS church, different directions that they were taking, and really just digging their heels in on things that we wished could change. And I found a supportive Facebook group, a community online with Mormon feminists, and they just introduced me to deeper issues, right? And it wasn't like they were trying to pull me away like my mom would probably say, but they were really validating to my concerns, and had solutions that they, potential solutions that they could see. And I had a lot of hope for change. But there was a series of excommunications that happened in 2014 that really just kind of shattered all of my hope for change in the church. And so
Mhm.
A lot of times Mormons will talk about having a shelf. So you have all these issues, these unanswered questions, and you just kind of put them on your shelf and forget about it. And then pretty soon, it might take something that seems insignificant, but before you know it, your shelf is shattered and your faith has shattered. So those excommunications were what did it for me, because I saw these people who were trying to create space and dialogue in the church, in the LDS church. And I just kept thinking like, gosh, I don't disagree with anything that they're saying really. And so if they're deemed apostate, if they are not worthy enough to be in this church, what does that say about me? And I had, 3 little kids. My son was a newborn, and I had these twin little daughters that were 3. And I just remembered what it was like growing up as a Mormon girl. And I couldn't do it to them. And I just couldn't do it to them. So I went several months coming home from church every week, just crying. And my husband's like, hey, I've been searching online and there's a Community of Christ congregation in Salt Lake. And I thought, well, no, like we can't do that. We're either going to be Mormon or we're not going to be religious. And I ended up going to Reunion in 2014, and Locke Mackay was our guest minister. And all of the questions, a lot for me was historical stuff that I was told was anti-Mormon lies. And Locke was like, no, that happened, but we can work through it. And history is not our theology. And I had never had anybody validate my questions or concerns. So I decided to keep going until it stopped working. And here I am.
Wow. That is quite the story. And I thank you for sharing all of that with us. You already kind of touched on this. My next question was going to be, what steered you towards investigating Community of Christ? And you mentioned that Josh how did Josh, hear about Community of Christ? And
yeah, so I always knew that the RLDS church existed, and so did Josh. My best friend, that we used to have a building in Orem, Utah, just north of us. And my friend and I would ride our bikes there, and we would ask her mom, like, what is this? Because the name was so similar, but yet, like, what is this reorganized thing? And I just remember her saying, like, well, they ordain women. It was like, oh, this. But I had been on a church history tour as a Mormon youth. So I had seen the temple. I had, been to different historic sites and things like that. And honestly, it was more out of historical curiosity. So we knew there was a schism in Nauvoo after Joseph's death, but we had only ever heard the side of Brigham Young, right?
Sure.
And so it was more, at the beginning, it was more just curiosity. Why did these people stay behind? Why didn't they follow Brigham? What was their theological difference? And pretty immediately it was like, well, dang, if we would have been living back then, we probably would have stayed behind too, right?
Wow.
It almost felt like, I've compared it before to having this, like, I don't know, divorce in your family, or this big, like your extended family, generations and generations back, and this tale that and then suddenly you hear, you've only known the dad's side of the story, and then suddenly you hear the mom's side of the story, and you're like, oh, this was more complicated than I thought. This wasn't clear cut. And it has been a challenge for me, just because my ancestors joined the church in Kirtland, and they chose to follow Brigham. And so we have polygamy in my family generations back. And so I've had to reconcile that of what does it mean to, leave the church of my birth and go back to a church and to a community that stood firm against something that was my family, right? It's been really interesting. But I honestly think that, Mormons talk a lot about redeeming the dead, and they do a lot of temple work for their dead ancestors.
Right.
And this kind of feels like my own way to reclaim redeeming my dead, right? And maybe they were happy polygamists, but I actually know that they weren't always. And so it's just been really interesting, because I can still claim this as my roots. These are still my people. This is still my heritage. This is still my story. But through Community of Christ, I've just been able to do it on a healthier way that makes a lot more theological sense for me.
Wow. Okay. Was there, you mentioned going to a reunion in 2014 and learning some things. Was there a moment that you can recall when you suddenly said to yourself, that's it, I'm joining Community of Christ?
Oh, that's another good question. It kind of came really fast.
Oh,
So
wow.
I mean, within a couple of weeks, right? Hearing the story of Community of Christ just like blew away all of my preconceived ideas about this community, cleared up all misunderstandings. And I do remember being given the hymnal and reading through it. I went to a women's retreat a couple months later, and Katie Harmon McLaughlin was our guest minister, and everybody left that retreat with the hymnal. And I remember, I don't even remember which song I opened it up to, but I looked through 3 or 4 of them. And I just remember sitting there and thinking, like, if this is actually what they believe, like, this is a safe place I can raise my kids in. Because like I mentioned, my daughters were a huge reason why I felt very compelled to act quickly and step away from our church. And so reading through the hymnals, and then also just being at church a time or two, and listening to the sermons and realizing that this was a theology truly grounded in the worth of all people, and that it didn't matter that I had all the answers, right? Like I could really, my faith could evolve and change within this community. And it was broad enough, yet focused on these central principles, like the enduring principles that I 100% agreed with. But as long as we were moving in that direction with the enduring principles and just our core theology at the heart of my beliefs, like I realized that I could change and evolve and still be accepted in this community. So it really took just a couple of weeks, because I'm pretty sure that women's retreat happened maybe a month after, or maybe even 3 weeks after that reunion experience. And I left that retreat knowing that this was a place that at least I felt safe raising my kids in.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay. You've mentioned your daughters a couple of times and how important it was for you to act quickly. And I did actually specifically have a question about your daughters in the context of, what does being raised in Community of Christ mean for them in terms of opportunities that they could have in their church life compared to what they might have had?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I have said that I was doing more as a non-member in Community of Christ than I ever could have as a Mormon woman. So planning a worship service is not something any Mormon women are allowed to do. There's, handling any sort of money. There's no voting on budgets, things like that. And so seeing that my kids, both my daughters and my son can have those opportunities really at a young age. I've planned a whole bunch of worship services, and I do include my kids in that. They know the basic flow of a worship service, and they have opinions about things. And if we don't do something at church for a couple of weeks that we normally do, they're like, why aren't we doing this anymore? Like they really, they really feel like their voice is part of the conversation. And my daughters now are 11. So they were kind of bummed that World Conference was postponed, because I think that would have been their last year they could have gone to Conference Kids. But I reached out to folks to find out, like, what do the teens or preteens do at World Conference, and found out all about that. So now they're super excited about that, and those are just opportunities
awesome.
that they never would have had. They're like, we can run notes to the first presidency, like they're super excited about it. So yeah, just, and seeing women in leadership, I think is hugely important. And when they were little, they would ask us questions like, why don't we go to the church that grandma and grandpa do anymore or whatever? And I, have a lot of reasons, but I had to just whittle it down to something that, 3 and 4-year-olds would understand. And we had a woman pastor at the time, Robin Linkhart was our pastor. And I just, bluntly said, like, she couldn't do that in the Mormon church. And yeah, so just knowing that really the sky is the limit for how much they can get involved in and what they can do. And no one's going to tell them no just because they're girls or just because they're women, has just been really, really awesome to see.
That's fantastic. All right. Now, can you help those of us on this on the show, in the studio audience, who might not know what a Latter-day Seeker is? What is a Latter-day? Well, I know what a Latter-day Seeker is, but I'd like you to tell us in your own words, what is a Latter-day Seeker and why do some people become seekers?
Yeah. So a Latter-day Seeker at this point in history is somebody who is interested in Community of Christ, who comes from the LDS or Mormon faith. I think, honestly, a lot of seekers become seekers for very, very similar reasons that I became a seeker. And I think that there is an amount of just like, how do I say this? The nuggets that Community of Christ has taken from the Restoration that are just so beautiful, like common consent and continuing revelation, those don't really exist in the LDS Church. Mormons know they should exist, and they do to maybe a tiny, tiny degree, but seekers are hungry. And they really, really like the way that we have lived out our expression of the Restoration. So I think that there's a lot of curiosity with seekers. There's sometimes misunderstanding. I mean, it can be a difficult ministry to be in just because folks bring in their own religious understanding or assumption. And
Sure.
there can be a lot that's lost in translation, if you will. But I think that most seekers are genuinely interested in us because they're impressed with where we are today and how we got there. So again, things like common consent, our scripture statement, being inclusive of women's ministry and LGBTQ ministry. I mean, the list goes on and on. But there usually, or there always is some break with them and the institutional LDS Church. And then again, they like the way that Community of Christ lives out our expression of the Restoration.
Wow, that's awesome. Okay. And what does, you've got quite the job title, by the way.
I do.
What does a social media seeker ministry specialist do?
So I support Latter-day Seeker ministry on the internet. That's kind of like the one sentence elevator pitch. So that includes not only seekers that are interested in Community of Christ that are coming from literally all over the world. I am helpful in that process of getting them connected to a minister, or I get contacted by ministers who are like, this seeker is asking me questions about X, Y, and Z. I have no idea what they're talking about. Can you help? And I also, like I just said, help support ministers who are working with Latter-day Seekers. So I kind of say that I help explain who Community of Christ is to Latter-day Seekers. And then I also explain Mormonism to Community of Christ folks who are working with ex-Mormons.
Right.
So I really do find myself in this place of in between and translating a lot because we have a lot of similar words, we have similar scriptures, but the way that almost everything is interpreted or used is very, very different. In addition to that, I also am the project manager for Project Zion podcast, and then I am one of the leaders of the Forward with Community team. Community, it's a online worship service and gathering for Latter-day Seekers. And we've had people all over the globe. It's nothing like Toronto where we publicly, like blast ourselves everywhere. But it's a small, intimate group that usually has, 10 to 20 people from all over the world. And most of them are coming from the Mormon church who have a genuine interest in Community of Christ. And yeah, that's basically my job.
That's awesome. That sounds like fun, actually.
It is.
Now, what are some of the questions that seekers always ask about Community of Christ? If you can give us a few examples of some of those questions that you just see all the time that seekers ask.
Yeah, so a lot of people want to know about church history. So what do we say about the first vision? What do we say about scripture or the Book of Mormon? What do we say about, I mean, you name a point in church history, Mormons really know church history. When I say church history, I mean those first 14 years. So a lot of historical questions come up, which is why Locke is such a great asset to the Latter-day Seeker community, because he knows the responses like the back of his hand. So there's also a lot of questions about how we got to today. So a lot of women are really curious, how did the church ordain women? What did that process look like? And that's one reason why I interviewed Becky Savage for Project Zion podcast. For her seminary degree, she did her thesis on that journey. So the historical journey of, you know, the different resolutions that had come forward, and really just laid everything out in this beautiful timeline. And so I knew that I wanted to get a, you know, audio narration of that basically. And so we have a 2-part podcast that I share all the time with how the, you know, the question, how did we get to the point of ordaining women? Same thing with LGBTQ inclusion. People are very interested about the concept of national conferences and mapping out which nations in the church have become inclusive and how that process is played out. Yeah, I would say those are probably the biggest ones. Women's issues, LGBT issues, and then historical questions.
Right, fair enough. And that's, you know, what I've seen in my experience working with seekers as well. Now, after you joined Community of Christ, I believe, if I recall correctly, you were ordained an elder. Is that correct?
So I was ordained a priest.
Oh, I'm sorry.
First, I am an elder now, but I was a priest.
Okay.
Yeah, so that call came, gosh, I think we were baptized and confirmed in January, and that call came at the end of August. So it was a little bit quick, but I also recognize, I mean, and I did wrestle with it. It was not an easy yes. And a big part of that was because a lot of my Mormon friends and family thought that I left the Mormon church to become ordained. So I felt like I was proving them right by being ordained so fast. So it was actually a struggle to say yes. But I also recognize that the area here in Salt Lake and in Utah was just, we are being flooded by seekers. I mean, literally flooded, you know, and we still are. Every single week we have new people, and that has not stopped. And so recognizing that I was in a unique position to know where seekers were coming from. And then also, I mean, when I say I did a deep dive, like I really did. Not that I was this expert on Community of Christ, but I had worked my way into the church, truly figuring out who this community was, because I didn't want to be duped again, right? I didn't want to like find these skeletons in the closet and then be like, well, shoot, we got to pack up and leave again. So,
Right.
so I felt pretty confident that I could stand in ordained ministry, you know, with some sort of legitimacy of being able to represent the church. It was super scary, and it still is a little scary. But yeah, we did it. And then a couple years later, I was ordained an elder. Right before the last World Conference, I was ordained an elder. So. And
is that fact that you are an elder, given your upbringing, does that at times feel a little bit surreal to you?
It kind of does. It's been interesting to, because like I said, we have a lot of visitors that come, right? My husband is a priest and I'm an elder, and that's really weird for people. People that come, and just in conversation, figuring out who's who, they
Sure.
sometimes just can't wrap their mind how I can be in a higher office, right? Because it's
Right.
so
Yeah.
hierarchical in the LDS church, and he was a Mormon elder. So yeah, surreal is a good way to phrase it. Sometimes people, I can tell, definitely don't respect that. Not necessarily seekers that come to Community of Christ, but the Mormon community that I still am very much in, there's not a lot of legitimacy, right? And it's not like I want to bang on my chest or whatever, but just the assumption that I'm still just this submissive Mormon housewife, like that's not who I am. And that's like the typecast that I have here. So yeah, it's been really interesting. We moved during the pandemic, and just like meeting neighbors and them finding out what I do and just saying that I'm a full-time minister, it's really, really shocking to people. And not necessarily in a good way all the time. And I can definitely tell that tension. So
Interesting. Okay. Can you tell us a little about, if you're comfortable answering this, your relationship with God before and after joining Community of Christ?
Yeah, that's a good question. So growing up, I definitely had the understanding that God was my personal God and that I needed to appease him in order to earn my salvation, right? So I was always in this cycle of doing everything good enough, believing enough, having enough faith, not questioning, just kind of in this never-ending hamster wheel cycle of just trying to earn God's love. And God was very much male, was very much an authority, was very much a final word, somebody that I was supposed to fear in some way or another. And so while I would have said I had a great relationship with God, it was kind of an abusive relationship. I mean, if you say those same characteristics with a romantic partner, like always trying to earn their love or always trying to be good enough and always trying to, like people would say like, why are you with that person, right? But that's the relationship with God that I had. And so coming to Community of Christ, and that's why in my bio, which I also have on the PZP website, that I believe in grace, right? I believe that all are worthy no matter what right now, and that we are created by a creator to be exactly who we are. And we don't have to just hustle for God's approval. And God is diverse. God is not necessarily male, and God can be male and female and both and I think that's the beauty of the Trinity, is that it leaves so much open for a relationship with God instead of this like really narrow view of having, this attribute and this attribute, and you have to do this and this and this, but it just really leaves it open for God being what you need God to be at any given moment. And so the images of God that I use personally change day to day or season by season. And to me, that's really beautiful. And it makes it way less about my salvation, because I no longer think that I have to earn my salvation. And it really turns me outward to see God in community and to see God in other people. Suddenly, we're not all in competition for this level of heaven. We're just in relationship with one another to bring peace and unity and diversity and to celebrate those things here and now. So the way that I've shifted in God has really shifted how I see virtually everything. It's been pretty good.
Glad to hear it. You mentioned the Salt Lake City congregation that Community Christ has in Utah. I heard that back in, before the big Latter-day Seeker movement kind of took off, I heard that we were down to maybe something like 6 members there. Mm-hmm. What is the demographics of our congregation there now?
Yeah, so I always like to tell people that if everybody who comes once or twice a month or a couple times a quarter or orbits around us in some way or another, if all of those people showed up, we would easily have, like, showed up on any given Sunday, we would have 150 people. We would have more children for sure than adults. For sure. Usually on a Sunday, and again, I mean, this is COVID, right? So it's weird, and we've like bounced back. We've only been going in person since the end of May, but we have had to bump online since then as well. So with all of that said, we normally have between 30 and 60 on any given Sunday, with maybe another 15 connections on Zoom. So last week, my family wasn't able to go, and there was like 15 or 20, and I think about 30 in the sanctuary, and that we would consider that a light Sunday. But wow. There was one of the first Sundays that we were back, I was actually really nervous because we're doing social distancing and things for COVID. And I was like, if anyone else comes through this door, we are going to have to turn them away or something. Like, I don't know what we're going to do because there's too many people in here. And we hit almost 70 that day. I think we were at like 66, trying to count all the little kids that were running around. So it was great. It's a great problem to have, but in the middle of a pandemic, it's a little bit stressful.
I can appreciate that for sure. Absolutely. Okay. What are some of the myths that non-members have about Community of Christ? And I know there's some that are kind of funny and amusing. Can you share some of those myths?
Yeah. So I think the funniest one is about the temple, right? Just that, like, it's almost, I mean, it is embarrassing to admit this, but I heard this as a kid growing up. But I thought that the reason why the Nautilus shell, spiral is spirally is because during the second coming, there's going to be, this was, my perceived RLDS thought, that y'all thought that a tornado was going to come and like Jesus was going to suck up your temple, like the city of Enoch in the Book of Mormon or something. And I truly believe that.
I have never actually heard that myth before. That is kind of funny.
Well, yeah, so that's a myth. And then the classic ones, like, we ran out of Smiths. I'm doing the quotes because that I hear that all the time from seekers. I'm like, no, we actually still have a lot of direct descendants from the Smiths. And then that's when you go into history and but yeah, so that's one. That the only reason why we had Grant McMurray is because we ran out of Smiths.
Sure.
Another one is that we've given up the Book of Mormon. I'm like, no, we just don't dictate how one believes, how one feels about the Book of Mormon or how one uses the Book of Mormon. But we have plenty of people that believe that it is a historical record. And then we have plenty of people that want to decanonize it. And we have everybody in between, and we all find a way to get along with one another. And we don't focus on our belief in a book, right? But that's one that I hear all the time too. I'm trying to think of what other ones I've heard. Those are probably, and to be clear, I don't think the temple one really flies around anymore. This was in the 90s, like late 90s, early 2000s, that I heard that rumor. But the last two are ones that I still hear a lot, that we ran out of Smiths and that we like decanonized or got rid of the Book of Mormon.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of funny myths out there that I've heard as well. How can members of Community of Christ support seekers?
That's a good question. So like I said, Latter-day Seeker ministry can be kind of tricky, right? People are coming to us not because everything is going right in their life. Like, seekers come to us because they are distrusting of religion, they are distrusting of God, they have questions, and they are devastated because there probably has been a big fracture between their neighborhood or their family or sometimes their spouse. So there's a lot of trauma with Latter-day Seeker ministry. And I think that sometimes as Community of Christ ministers, we might not always recognize that level of trauma. And so if they are angry or they lash out, or if they're just really, really emotional, I know some ministers have taken that personally and have said, you know, like, oh, what did I do wrong? Did I say the wrong thing, or whatever it may be? And just knowing that, no, the problem is not with you. The problem is with the faith transition and just the intense level of deconstruction that people go through. I've known people whose spouses have left them, whose adult children never talk to them anymore, I know young adults who have been written out of wills of their parents. I mean, this is really heavy stuff. And if the seeker doesn't stick around, it's not the minister's fault. So I guess you asked, how can we support how can we support seekers? And that would be just to listen with an open mind. And if seekers come through your door, maybe having some of these misconceptions like you ran out of Smiths, just know that they are working with a very small knowledge probably of who we are. And so clarifying who we are with love is always really helpful. But then don't take it personally if we're just not a good fit for all ex-Mormons. And then, as always, like, literally part of my job is to help people who are engaged in Latter-day Seeker ministry. And so you can always reach out to me. I've had a couple of ministers reach out, and, you know, they talk about how a seeker just is hung up on this one thing, and they can't figure out why it's a big deal to them. And then I say, like, well, from a Mormon perspective, this is why this matters. And they're like, oh, if I would have known that, then, you know, I could have. And it's like, yeah, just talk to people who have been on this journey, and there probably is a really easy way to find common ground and just shared understanding.
Okay. Thank you for that insight. That'll be very helpful. What can you tell us about some of the things that, in your experience, LDS members, and this could include even non-seekers, when they hear certain things about Community of Christ, that they are kind of in awe about?
I think even when I talk about the process of common consent, even with my very, very LDS family members, they are super impressed. The idea that you can bring something to, what is the word? Resolutions. Resolutions to World Conference. And you can vote on them locally, right? To then get them to the next level. And like the grassroots way that our church works, and that we can actually have an issue that we feel compelled to talk about, and it can go up the chain of command, if you will, and get presented in front of the body of the church, and then it's talked about and discussed and voted on. That blows people's minds away. And similarly, business meetings, your regular old business meetings, are usually something that people find super fascinating and are in awe by. It was kind of funny. One of my first times coming to Community of Christ was our annual business meeting, because I came at the end of the summer, early fall. And people were very apologetic about it. They're like, oh, church is not going to be fun today. We're just having our business meeting, but here's the paper if you want to look over it. I'm like, wait a second. Like, this is amazing. Like, you can see how much money comes in, and you can see where it goes. And I can see how much we pay to this and this and this. Like, I know how much we spend on mowing the lawn. Like, this is incredible. And we can debate that, and we can argue it. Like, it was ridiculous how excited I got about it, because that stuff is all done behind closed doors with like a small handful of men, 0 women in the LDS church. So the fact that I was just handed a paper with our entire budget on it was just incredible to me. Wow. And usually when I talk to even faithful active Mormons about that kind of thing, they're like, whoa, and you all get along and there's not big drama? And I'm like, well, I didn't necessarily say that, but we still find a way to live in community together.
We've had drama.
We have had drama. Yeah,
definitely have had drama.
Well, it was kind of funny. Sorry.
Nope, go ahead.
It was kind of funny. It took a few years after I came to the Salt Lake congregation to experience a business meeting that didn't just like vote the approval with what our financial officer had said. And it was a huge moment for us because when I came to Community of Christ, there was a fair amount of Mormons that came because of those excommunications. So we were all pretty new. So we were just like, yeah, whatever Penny has to say, right? Like, we'll go for it. But then a few years later, somebody opposed it and like, you know, argued with it. And we were all like, whoa, I think we're officially Community of Christ now. Like, we are challenging the budget. And Penny, like our financial officer, was just like, this is great. And like, it was just a silly moment that, you know, we had arrived because we could challenge something. It was a big deal.
Well, it's interesting that you describe it as a silly moment, but it's really not. And what you were just kind of talking about over the last couple of minutes is actually a great segue into my next question, which is, what are some of the things that members of Community of Christ, and I guess I'm in my mind, I'm kind of thinking those of us who've been born and raised in Community of Christ, take for granted that maybe we shouldn't take for granted?
Everything. I sound like the biggest church nerd, but I really do love this community. I love that hearing the story of the church and hearing those pivotal moments in church history, like when W. Wallace was faced with the question of, what if there's a discrepancy between what Joseph Smith said and what Jesus said? You know, who are we going to go with? And Wallace B. Smith said, we're going to go with Jesus. Like, that is huge, right? And like, not a lot of Community of Christ people think about that every day like I do. It makes all the difference. I think that just having common consent and having a church that as soon as you're baptized and are part of this community, you actually have a voice. And it's not just this throwaway, you know, whatever vote. Like, you can bring forth proposals, and you want to start a ministry in your congregation, like, do it, and you can build it into the budget. Just the reality that we have the power and the ability to shape our church experience to be how we need it to be and how we see it, like, contextually in our local environment, right? So the church here looks different than your congregations in Canada. And like, that's awesome. And you can be part of shaping your community, and I can be part of shaping my community. And again, we have these core values and these core beliefs that we share, but it's lived out so differently. And I feel like a lot of Community of Christ folks are sometimes even apologetic about that. They're like, well, I don't know, we're just this tiny little church, and I don't know, we don't have, you know, like the nice programming or whatever. But it's like, no, that's not what this is about. I mean, church is about living your faith in your local communities. And we just do that so beautifully through the process of common consent, with this lens of the worth of all people. And that's just incredible to me. It's just incredible.
That's awesome. Have you had the opportunity yet to vote on accepting a revelation being added to the Doctrine and Covenants?
Yes. And it
What was that like?
Wild. So yeah, we went to the World Conference in 2016 when 165 was canonized, and it was amazing. I came into Community of Christ after those words of counsel had been given, but we were still doing a lot of discernment with them, conversations. Linda Booth was, you know, interviewing President Beasy, and I really latched on to 165 and just kind of assumed that it was going to be canonized. But then it kind of hit me that, like, well, wait, actually, maybe it won't, because this church does have the opportunity to, like, not include it, right? And I get that that's never historically happened. But going to conference and seeing that play out and seeing people openly disagree with 165 was still incredible. I remember in one of our caucus meetings, this woman got up and her voice was shaking. You could tell she was really nervous, and she said, I can't vote for this. My congregation, we've we've tried working with these words and we just can't accept them. And everyone was okay with that. Like it was okay to disagree. And she was handled in a very pastoral way. And, she was heard and she was affirmed and loved. And I'm sure that was a really tricky place for her to be in. And I don't even know who this woman was. It just, the moment was so just ingrained in my head as being just this moment of faithful disagreement, and recognizing that people actually could vote against it and debate it and talk about it honestly, right? But when the vote came and it was overwhelmingly accepted, it was a really joyous moment for me, because it was again a really important document that made me interested in Community of Christ. And the conversations surrounding this document were a big part of me saying, like, yeah, I actually think that there is a place for me here. But then to see it be canonized was just super awesome. So then, of course, we have to like update your scriptures and all that stuff. And I'm like tweeting and like on Instagram and Facebook. And that's adding sections to the Doctrine and Covenants is not something the LDS Church does. And so to see that part of our history and our heritage played out in my lifetime through Community of Christ was super, super cool. Again, kind of redeeming my dead ancestors by saying, like, look, we're still doing the thing that you guys did. It was great.
That's awesome. I'm glad you've had that experience. I've had that experience, and it is an incredible experience to get to, vote for canonizing that document, or to have the opportunity to oppose it.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I've noticed in my participation in the Seekers groups is there's a constant barrage of questions in the form of, what is your policy on X? Or what is your position on blank? And the response is always, or not always, but is often, well, we don't have a policy on that, or we don't have a position on what kind of car you can drive, or whatever it is. Can you tell us a little bit about, like, what's the basis for that kind of type of questioning?
Yeah, so that this makes me laugh, because you're absolutely right. In Mormonism, there is an opinion or a teaching on just about everything. I don't want to sound too anti-Mormon, but they tell you what to eat, drink, dress, like everything, right? Everything is pretty controlled through the word of wisdom and through their code of modesty and those kinds of things. So Mormons are used to having their church tell them everything to do from the time they wake up. I mean, things like scripture study, and they have a lot of programmings that shape your everyday existence. And so when they come to Community of Christ, it's like, well, what's your position on this? How do you view scripture study? What do you think about modesty? What do you believe about the word of wisdom, right? Like, they go through, what they're doing is going through the rules that they are supposed to live by as Mormons, and seeing what Community of Christ has to say about that. So their whole day, their religion is in the back of their head, pushing forward their decisions. And so I think what they're trying to do, and I did this too, is they're trying to say, what would my life look like if I was a member of Community of Christ? And if I was, if I experienced whatever policy that is in the LDS Church, if I was in that position, whether it be something as controversial like abortion, or whether it be, does Community of Christ wear temple garments? Like, that's a question I get all the time. And anything in between, right? They're trying to figure out how much of their life is going to be controlled by the church, which sounds really negative, but I think that truly is what they're doing.
Wow. Okay. Well, I hate to say it, but we are nearing the end of our hour. But I do have another question for you, which is, what is something that you wish everyone knew about Community of Christ?
There's a lot of things. I wish that people understood that you do not have to go to a big congregation with a lot of kids or with all the fancy programs, et cetera, to have a good church experience. So when my family came to the Salt Lake congregation, like you said, David, we like doubled the congregation almost, right? Like they had, less than 10 people. And here we come, a family of 5, and we were the only kids that were there. There had been some other seeker kids, but they had gone back to the LDS church. And so for a long time, my kids were the only ones in the congregation. Mm-hmm. And some people really struggle with that. But I don't think that church has to be this place where everyone is the same or where you'll have peers your own age. Like, a lot of my best friends in Community of Christ are over 60, and I wouldn't have it any other way. A lot of my kids' best friends are over 60, and I think it's good for them. And I think that it's good for the people over 60 too, right? Like, sure. It's good for all of us. And so I wish that people could see the potential and not just see the smallness or see like, oh, there's no young adults or there's nobody my kids' age, because I don't think that matters. And again, the core principles and values we have are things that I think everybody should be learning, no matter their age. And to have an intergenerational experience like that, where my kids aren't just falling back on their peers that happen to be their age. I mean, we have tons of mentors for them in the church. And I think that that's really, really beautiful. So I wish that people could see that just because we're small, just because there might not be local people your same age or your kids' ages, that doesn't mean that you should give up on the community in general.
Wow. Well, that's an amazing response and a very refreshing response. So thank you for sharing that with us, Brittany. And thank you for sharing all of your insights and your experiences. This has been fantastic. And thank you so much for being on our show today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. It was really fun to be here.
Well, thank you both, David and Brittany. And Brittany, we really appreciate you're willing to spend your time with us today. I also want to thank everybody else for joining us today. At this time, we will open the floor for people to do some sharing or say goodbye or whatever they like. So please stay around for a minute or two.
Hi, everyone. There's Claire Shepherdson.
There we go.
That was a wonderful interview. And
oh my gosh.
Thank you both very much. You open our eyes to who we really are. It makes a difference to hear another voice.
I agree.
Yeah. And it's really different being a person who was not raised in Community of Christ and having an understanding of what it means to be a seeker and not having any connection with the Mormon church. And I thought, okay, well, I've had a similar experience. I've come from another faith. I've been to World Conference to see the doctrines in 2016 as well. So, but it's important that you do have that history that I don't. And it's got to be a learning journey for me to learn more of that history and understanding.
Yeah, thank you for that. I do think it's interesting because in general terms, a lot of the lessons that we've learned with Latter-day Seekers, I think can be applied to seekers in general, people who feel left out of their own faith community. One of my dear friends is a convert who was really hurt by the Catholic Church, and she didn't really have a faith community, but even some experiences that she had going to a Catholic school, you know, they reflect a lot of the emotions in my own story. And so even though our stories are different, there's enough of an overlap to feel alienated by a church and then finding acceptance in a church. And I think that that's it's really important to share those stories.
Yes, I want to thank you very much, Brittany. This has been very, very enlightening. But I also want to applaud your courage that you have had back in 2013 for you to do what you have done, and the ministry that you're bringing today, I think, is a revelation to everyone.
Thank you. That was really sweet. You all have been very worth it.
Mary?
I just love Brittany's family. I follow them on Facebook for quite a while. I listened to all the podcasts. I actually met them at conference, and watching them grow, and they're just the most delightful family. Just so much fun. I just feel like I know the girls. I could just embrace them the minute I see them. And your little son there, he's really something. Yeah, but you know, I can appreciate how difficult this was for you. And I had a girlfriend, a close friend that was LDS. And so I know a little bit about what it is to kind of break away from the traditions. And also, I have a daughter that teaches in Phoenix, has many LDS children in her class. And another one that nurses, and she said, boy, they just have babies and babies and babies. I mean, they don't stop till after 6, you know, and it's amazing. But one thing that kind of like the structure, the bishop is actually the pastor, is he not? And you're kind of called in periodically to measure up to how you're living your life.
Mhm.
Wow. That's really something. And then how they tithe. I mean, that's different too. I mean,
Mhm.
there's a lot of freedom for us. Also the fact that they live in wards, and sometimes if you're going to move, they'll even suggest a ward that you should move to so that you'll be encompassed and close to the church and supportive of that congregation. So I know quite a bit about it, and I realize that in your family, this must have been difficult. Thank goodness that they still love you and embrace you, and you're, you know, understand what you're doing without, well, it's the same thing with John Hamer, like his family are still Mormons, and but that you're totally accepted and given the right to make your own journey.
Yeah.
Anyways, I just love the family.
My kids are wild.
It's so much fun.
That means they're healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are. They're good kids. They're good kids.
Jeannie?
Hi, Brittany. Thank you so much for this. I've heard you on podcasts, but I've never seen you face to face. My question was, were you and your husband pretty much in the same step through this whole process from the beginning? And it sounds like Mary knows your family well, but I don't. And my second question was how it affected your immediate family and what's the resolution been?
So we were not necessarily in sync the whole time. He really freaked me out because he started this journey first and I was not ready. And he was the one that initially started going to Community of Christ. He had attended 4 or 5 times before I joined him. But I had enough things again on that metaphorical shelf that were bothering me that I knew he wasn't wrong in his doubting and in his seeking, but I just was still uncomfortable with it. And so it took me to really face my own doubts and frustrations and that shelf that I had with all of my issues in order for me to join him, really is what happened. I will also say though, that once I hopped on the Community of Christ train, I ran with it way quicker than I think he was ready to. Because it was like, I taught the children in our ward, and then the next week I was going to Community of Christ, and I'm like, okay, we got to write a letter to our bishopric saying that we're not coming back anytime soon. And he's like, what? Like, this is not like, this is intense. So yeah, I fell in love quicker than he did, but like also gave up on Mormonism quicker than he did. I think he would have stuck around for a while longer had I not just been like, nope, I'm done, and jumped ship almost, quite literally. As far as our family goes, I mean, my immediate family, my daughters were 3, my son was a newborn. And so I kind of saw it as my short window of opportunity that I could get them out before they really knew a difference. Our families, though, siblings and parents, they were all super devastated. We didn't tell them that we were joining. When we joined, I had a little sister on a Mormon mission, and it was really important for me to officially join Community of Christ before she came home, just so it was a done deal. It was not up for debate. She couldn't try to talk me out of it. And she's super supportive now, but I think that just it would have been difficult coming right off her mission, right? Extended family was difficult. We had a lot of really emotion-filled emails and phone conversations and dinner gatherings, and everybody tried to talk us out of it. It was really, really hard. But when my twins were baptized when they were 8, I baptized one and my husband baptized the other, and all of our extended family that lived in Utah came. So all 4 grandparents came, aunts and uncles, cousins. I mean, everybody was there. And that was something that I thought would never happen. I'm not going to say they liked it or that it was comfortable, but they showed up for my girls. So that was really exciting. My son is 7, so he'll theoretically be baptized in the next little while. And I'm kind of hoping to have a similar experience. I'm maybe assuming to have a similar experience. We'll see. Again, pandemic, so I don't quite know what that's going to look like. But yeah, it's now kind of just become almost this elephant in the room that we don't really talk about. But my parents did give me a Starbucks gift card for Christmas, which felt like a huge olive branch, like an extent, So I think they're coming around. They recognize we're not changing at this point. So things are okay. They love us and we know that. So it's good.
Lou, you had your hand up.
Yes, I just want to say again, thank you for all that you do, and particularly for the Project Zion podcast. We've had some seekers show up at our congregation for the first time. I haven't met them in person yet, but just over the phone and so on. And I can't tell you how great it has been to have those resources of the podcasts and the other things that you have done as tools or as resources to help them with. The other thing I just wanted to ask is you were just starting seminary as I was actually finishing, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how that experience impacted your ministry and your Community of Christ experience.
Yeah, so it was kind of funny when David was reading the bio, it said something that I was a recent graduate, but I'm like, oh, that might be kind of old because I'm getting old and now I've been graduated for several years. But seminary was great. I knew that I wanted to do some sort of theological education, right? And I didn't know if I wanted just to do something here locally or what. But very quickly I settled on, not settled, I decided for Community of Christ Seminary. Truly, it would have been staying something here. But I wanted to go to Community of Christ Seminary because I really wanted to hear Christian theology and history and restoration history through the lens of Community of Christ. So again, Mormons are really good with church history, but really good with one like narrow interpretation of history, right? And so our church history classes, church history, scripture, and theology just were incredible. And I got to have Dale Luffman as my professor. I think our class was the last one that he taught. So I feel really like that was just such a cherished experience for me. Mark Shear was also my professor. And of course, Tony Shabala Smith was my professor for multiple things. But it was just so good to have a foundational understanding of what Christianity is, because I really didn't know a whole lot about the history of Christianity, and that there's a lot of different theological thoughts in Christianity, right? Like even within Christianity, what are you talking about, right? There's tons of different ways to look at this story. And so that really broke open my brain, really, to just have a heart to be continually seeking, and just this understanding that it's okay that my theology changes, and it's okay if Seeker's theology changes, because that's the history of this church in Community of Christ and in Christianity. So I really loved my time with Community of Christ Seminary, and honestly, had I gone anywhere else, it would have been a completely different experience, and it wouldn't have just given me that lens that Community of Christ has, just again with like enduring principles and like tracing those back through our church history and that kind of thing. So yeah, it was really, really good. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of work, but it was great.
Well, I think at this point, we'll take the opportunity to wrap things up. Thank you again, Brittany. It has been wonderful spending time with you here today. So goodbye for now.
Brittany, if you
everyone.
want to bring the kids, bring them on in for the campfire tonight.
We'll see what their moods are like.
And we'll look forward to having you at the campground someday. That
That'd
would be awesome.
great.
Yeah.
Got to get through this pandemic.
Yep.
Bye, friends.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.